Hello, photographers. I am here with my friend and fellow photographer Mark Evers, and we want to discuss the Pentax KP camera, which was recently announced. This is the Pentax K-mount APS-C, so this is a crop censored camera, 24 megapixels, which is standard across their APS-C censored line. It has a tilty flippy screen on the back, which is different from the other APS-C cameras, because right now you have the K3, which the screen is fixed. It doesn't articulate or move at all. And then the K70, which has a fully articulating screen along with the KS2. One of the standout features is the ISO range, which is a base ISO of 100 up to a max of 819,200, which is kind of crazy, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think that the highest that's out there that I'm aware of, at least for APC anyways.
I think it's the highest out there, period. I think the flagship ISO cameras up to this point have been the A7S and A7S II from Sony, and those are full-frame 12 megapixel cameras. And those top out at the 409,800 or whatever it is. It seems likely that this ISO is going to be garbage in terms of usability.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I suspect it'd probably be the ISO 6400 is probably quite usable. Probably 12,800 is probably getting there and starting to push it. But I think that this 819,200 is just some make-believe ISO, which obviously you'll be able to set it to that, but it's some sort of an ISO that's just unrealistic and probably would not produce any results that are usable.
Yeah, and one of the things that makes it pretty likely that's going to happen is what I mentioned, the fact that the A7S cameras have a full frame sensor and deliberately use a smaller megapixel count of 12 megapixels to use larger photo sites to improve the light gathering ability, which improves the high ISO performance. Here we have an APS-C sized sensor, which is roughly, in terms of surface areas, roughly half the size, and 24 megapixels. So you have double the megapixel count, half the surface area, which means you are going to have significantly smaller photo sites, which is going to significantly degrade the ISO performance. Now, I think we both want to be proven wrong in assuming that it's going to be garbage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I feel pretty safe in saying that it's going to be garbage.
Yeah, I think they just sort of added this in just to get some bragging rights. But the one thing that I'm curious about is whether or not that ISO, that high ISO, is whether that's native or whether it's an expanded ISO, because that will of course make somewhat of a difference as well too.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's going to be an expanded ISO, but we'll have to see when it comes out, because there's no word as of yet whether or not that's native or expanded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of the things that you were telling me before we started recording, Mark, is that Pentax announced or clarified that this is a mid-range camera, putting it in between the K70 and the K3, or K3 at this point.
Right.
But it's weird because we have features that sort of supersede the K3, but then features that fall underneath it, but then a price point that matches that of the K3 when the K3 was launched.
Yeah, and if they do introduce a new top-of-the-line crop body, then where are they going to put that in the price point as well, too? So it's definitely a bit of an oddball camera and area for it to be sitting in.
Indeed, especially with that price point, because with that price point, before that clarification, many people were calling this a K3 successor, but Pentax has basically said that that's not the case. And I think by doing that, they're sort of telegraphing to us that there is going to be a price increase on the K3 if that camera is in development and on a roadmap for release.
Right.
That clarification helps, but it still makes the features a little bit odd, because you have this ISO, which, I mean, may or may not be usable at higher ISOs than the K3, but it at least has a range that is greater than that. You have video features that are weaker than the K3. You also have, a burst mode that's slower than the K3-2. The K3-2 has an 8.3 frame per second burst versus the 7 frames on the KP, and a smaller buffer. On the KP, you can shoot up to 8 RAWs or 28 JPEGs, versus on the K3-2, you can shoot 23 RAWs and up to 60 JPEGs. And then the K3-2 can shoot 1080p at 60 frames per second, but on the KP, if you want that 60 frame per second at a 1080 resolution, you're using 1080i, not the higher quality 1080p. So it's, I think the price point is what really confuses us here, because this makes sense as a mid-range when you look at these feature comparisons. But that price point telegraphs something different in terms of Pentax's line. Now, we've got a couple of interesting standout features, one of which you mentioned, Mark, the 1/24,000th of a second electronic shutter speed. So tell us a little bit about that and why that's such an interesting feature.
Well, I think it's an interesting feature because just with the regular shutter, it only goes up to 1/6000th of a second, whereas this 1/24,000th of a second, if you're shooting just regular photos, in theory you might be able to actually be shooting outdoors in the bright sun with like a 50 millimeter 1.8 lens, and potentially actually being able to shoot with it wide open without having to have any sort of neutral density filter. So I think that in itself is kind of interesting to see the potential that's there for that.
One of the things to note is, being the electronic shutter, you have to use the camera in live view mode. You won't be able to use the the optical viewfinder. What would also be interesting would be if you could sync flash at that electronic shutter speed, or even if it was like 1/8000th of a second, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet on that, because with the K1, with the electronic shutter, the flash is actually disabled.
Interesting. Yeah. Well,
so I'm wondering whether this will do the same thing or not.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that Pentax has been pretty weak on, is their flash sync speeds. So this syncs at 1/180th of a second, which is in line with all of Pentax's older SLRs, but the K1, that one syncs at 1/200th of a second, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And then we have the aperture and shutter speed bracketing. Those are kind of weird too. What do you think about those features? And if you want to explain them too.
Yeah, well, they're definitely a little bit weird. Like, my understanding is that with that system, one of the options you'd be able to do is like almost like a focus stacking, where like if you're doing like a macro shot, you'd potentially be able to focus on a spot, and then the camera will focus, I guess, probably in front and behind to give you a larger depth of field. So I think that's something that could be interesting, especially for those that do macro photography.
Yeah, that's a nice thing to have inbuilt focus stacking. These, I think, are slightly newer features, though. With this aperture bracketing, you can actually essentially bracket your depth of field, so you can shoot like you could program the camera to shoot at the same shot at f2.8 and f5.6 and f8 as an example, which will then give you 3 similar shots with the same exposure in terms of lighting, but different depth of field.
Right. And pick the one that you like.
Exactly. And then you can do the same thing with the shutter speed in terms of motion. So you could say shoot it at 1/10th of a second, 1/100th of a second, and 1/1000th of a second to see which one you like the motion in better. And it's nice to have them. I can't see that I would use something like that, but
I would agree. But for somebody perhaps who's just starting out, it might be an interesting feature to use to get a feel for how the different shutter speeds and apertures work and affect what they're trying to do. With more experienced photographers, they're obviously going to have a pretty good idea as to what's going to do what. But for somebody starting out, I think it'd definitely be different. But I think most photographers probably wouldn't use a feature like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the design of this camera itself, because it sort of looks like a baby K1, but then again, not. This is an interesting DSLR because it has this interchangeable front grip hump. So rather than a standard DSLR grip hump, it's got, I believe it comes with this default one that you see in the photo we're looking at here. But you can buy different accessory grips and change them out. But what's also curious is because it doesn't have the standard DSLR hump, we've got a vertically facing front control dial.
The grips is, I guess, lack of a better term, a little confusing, because being able to customize your grip to feel the way you like it is kind of an interesting idea. But then in hindsight, if it's only coming with the one grip and then you can additionally purchase the other grips, is you could potentially buy the one that you think you want, put it on, and it turns out that you don't like it, and you might have to end up purchasing however many styles there are to actually find one that you like. So I find that a little bit strange, and I honestly don't think that they would sell a lot of these extra grip accessories. It's definitely a little bit of an oddball thing. D-dial, I think the fact that it is vertical versus horizontal is definitely a little bit strange. But I've always shot with either like a K7, a K5, or the K1, where that E-dial is horizontal. Now, perhaps someone who shoots with one of the other cameras where the front E-dial is on like a 45-degree angle or whatever it is, they might have a easier time adjusting to this. But I suspect it would be very awkward to use no matter what camera you're used to shooting with. It's definitely not the sort of dial that you see as being user friendly.
I would agree with that. I'm very concerned about the usability of that dial. It feels to me, with the low profile of that grip hump, that it's going to be hard to hold the grip and control the dial with your index finger, which is most people's preferred finger for the grip, or for that dial. You could potentially get it with your thumb, but that feels just as awkward. So I feel like it's going to be a problem accessing it when you want to change something. But at the same time, I also feel like the position of that dial makes it susceptible to very easily knocking your settings out of place without realizing it when you're just handling the camera and positioning it and getting ready to shoot.
Right. And yeah, because it'd be a fine line whether or not it's has good firm clicks in it, which again would make it awkward to try and change, or whether it's a fairly smooth rolling thing, and in which case, like you said, it'd be easy to knock it.
And I feel like the placement of that dial is dictated in part by the addition of the new third control dial, which was debuted on the K1 full-frame camera. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, first of all, since you shoot with the K1, on the usability of that third control dial in general first, and then the inclusion of it on this camera.
Well, when I first got the K1, I was kind of thinking that it seemed like a useless feature, because for myself, the main reasons I would have potentially thought of using it would be for changing my ISO or for my exposure compensation. But the fact that on the K1 right on top there, right beside that dial, there are buttons for the exposure compensation, the ISO. So it was almost redundant having them on there. That being said, I don't mind it so much now, because I'll usually use it for switching between crop mode and full frame mode and square crop mode, and so it's kind of handy in that respect. But that's probably the only thing I used it for, other than for being in the correct mode for focus peaking if I'm manually focusing. I do notice with this one here, it has the exposure compensation button on the top, but it doesn't have the ISO. But looking at the E-dial, like that programmable dial on the top, it doesn't have either one of those modes on it. But it does look like it has three modes that you can custom set for yourself, so you can potentially set one of them to the ISO. Is a dial that's needed? Probably not, because even though I did say that I do use it, I can easily access those same options that I would normally be using that dial for through the quick menu on the camera anyways. So to me, if it wasn't there, it wouldn't hurt my feelings any.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see it as a dial that I would use if I had the K1 or this KP. And I think on the KP, and this is just my opinion in looking at it and thinking of the usability of it, but I think on the KP that the inclusion of that dial actually makes this camera a little less user-friendly, because in keeping that low profile, it forces that front control dial to be in the vertical position, which we already discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And if that third control dial wasn't there, you could then place that front control dial back on the top plate in a more traditional position, which is easier to access and spin and use, and still keep the low profile design of the camera. And the other thing that's weird about the inclusion is if this is a mid-range camera, I'm wondering if they're intending to make this third control dial standard across their entire line, because you would think that if this is a mid-range camera and that third control dial is reserved for their higher ends, then it would stay on the K1 and probably go on the K3 Mark III. Again, if that is a camera that's in the roadmap.
Right.
For my money, it doesn't pay to have it on this camera and force that front control dial to be in that awkward position up front. And another thing I want to mention about that front control dial, when I was looking at it earlier, I noticed that where the power switch is positioned makes it seem to me like it'd be very easy to accidentally turn the camera on or off while trying to run your finger over that control dial and change a setting.
I would agree.
So, I mean, all in all, I feel like this camera is just going to land kind of awkwardly. The K1 was a really big splash, and people were very excited for this. And it feels like that was a big hit, and this is going to be a bit of a belly flop.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of worried about too. Like, it obviously has some features to make it a higher end camera, like the fact that you can add the additional grip to it. But then in other respects, it has just the one card slot versus like the K3 has the two card slots, and the K1 having two card slots. So it's, in that respect, it's sort of a step backwards. So, but it's definitely not a duck for sure, because it's just some of the features that it has and some of the features that it doesn't have, or is a little bit stripped down compared to like the K3 too. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how the camera does, and I do hope it does well, because myself, I'm a Pentax shooter and I like the Pentax line, so I hope that it does do well for them.
I want it to do well, because I'm the same. I like Pentax. They make solid cameras. I have no doubt that this is going to be a solid performer in terms of, image quality and all of the other things that Pentax cameras routinely do.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of feel like Pentax is throwing spaghetti at the wall here, to be perfectly honest, right? Because I'm willing to bet money that clarification of this being a mid-range camera came after they realized everybody was calling this a K3 successor or replacement.
Like this, the K01, not the K1, but the K01.
Yes,
it was sort of a, not really a dud, but sort of a dud. But people who actually own the camera really loved the camera, but a lot of people had a hard time getting enthused about it. And I think same with like the KS1 with all those crazy LED lights on it. It's like the specs were good on it, but with all, it's just, I think people had a hard time latching on to the idea of it being so spaceshipy, I guess, for lack of a better term. But at least with the KP, it doesn't have a weird look to it, other than maybe the interchangeable grip. But if you get used to a grip that's there, then you get used to it and that weird E-dial. So at least the camera looks, for the most part, like a normal, nice looking working camera. It's just some of the features are just a little bit strange, and so like I said, it's hard to place exactly where this camera should be sitting in the lineup.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of design, I really like the general profile and design of the camera body.
Yeah,
it's just
absolutely.
It's just the placement of that front control dial that really worries me in terms of usability.
Yeah, I think that would be my biggest stickling feature with the camera, would be that front E dial. Otherwise, it looks like a nice camera and will probably work quite well.
Any other thoughts you want to share on this camera before we wrap it up, Mark?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered most of the bases, that the key points people would be interested in anyways.
Yeah, I hope that this is a success for Pentax, but I'm afraid it's going to be a bit of a dud in terms of adoption, which is too bad.
Maybe it'll be like an Etzel.
Yeah, maybe. And then, 20 years from now, people will rave about it. But
right.
Yeah, we'll have to see. At any rate, if you have any questions about the Pentax KP or photography in general, let us know down in the comments. And then do me a favor and like this video and subscribe to my channel. And then click this link right here or the card up in the corner here and subscribe to Mark's channel. But whether or not you do any of that, the most important thing you need to do is get out there and take some damn photos. Mark and I will see you in the next photo blab.
Bye, everybody.